40% of adults in the UK are single, meaning they have never married and are not cohabiting. That's 8.4 billion single-person households. And figures like that are on the rise. How is the church to engage, love, and care for this significant proportion of our society and our congregations? Many churches have a de facto default towards married people and families. The culture and practices of a church community often emphasise marriage as the expected or better lifestyle, which can make single members feel marginalised or excluded. Today I'm speaking with Jackie Elton and Beth Chan, who both work with the Single Friendly Church Network. We try to unpick the biases, understand the needs, and explore how church could be a more welcoming community for single people. We also explore how Christmas time can be particularly challenging and what we can do to support the various experiences of single people in our churches at that time. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast. Here we go. Hello, welcome Jackie and Beth to the Roots for Churches podcast. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you for having us.
Can we just start off with a little bit of an introduction? So maybe Beth, you can go first. Tell us a bit about yourself and how you got involved with Single Friendly Church.
Yeah, so I've been working for Single Friendly Church for about 8 years now. And I got involved because I think at the time, well, obviously I was looking for a job, but I was also single and I was at that age where all of my friends were getting married and I was attending church, I was attending Christian festivals and conferences. And I just started to notice that at the front, things were always led by a married couple. And the language was just talking about, so which families have come from which kind of place. And it just made me feel either like a child because, you know, I was a daughter with kind of parents, but I was very much an adult, or it made me feel like the odd one out because I didn't have a family of my own. So that was really what drew me to the organisation, wanting to make a difference.
Mm. And Jackie?
So, about 25 years ago, I set up a business and set up a website, and that was Christian Connection, which was a dating site. So it was for single people who were Christians who wanted to get married. That was great, and people are still getting married, and that was great. But of course, a lot don't get married. And we began to learn about the frustrations and the lives of single people, of which I'm one. And I sort of had this mad idea to do a survey. We asked far too many questions. And you know what it's like, all these web surveys. But we did the survey quite a long time ago now. And we had 3,000 people sort of not only replied, but replied in heavy detail. And it was just like an outpouring of the way they felt about the church and how the church had treated them. And it was just so massive that it was like, well, what do we do about this? And first of all, we thought, well, we better publish these results. And everybody was saying, you've got to publish this. And then, of course, you publish it, a few articles come out, and that's about it. So gradually, it all grew into a campaign. We couldn't just sort of leave it there and go, yeah, well, it's a bit of a problem. So it took shape into a campaign, and that's where we are now.
Wow. Yes. So what you've described is that there is a bit of a problem. There is some sort of a bias against single people in the church, and it's probably not intentional, perhaps, but there does seem to be this sort of default setting of like marriage or family as the highest or the pinnacle or the expectation for everybody.
I mean, it's both church and society, because probably there was a time in the 19s or early 60s when most people got married unless there was something very odd about them or perceived to be odd. And of course now society has changed tremendously, but the church is still kind of stuck in a perception of, and its thinking is based on some very old thinking. So a lot of the leaders of the church is like, well, if people aren't married, there's something not quite right about them, or, you know, God's not in it. And if they do get married, well, that's fantastic. So society has changed. More and more people are single. And that is worldwide. I mean, I was mentioning to you, I just come from Japan. And yeah, it's everywhere. People don't necessarily want to get married, or they find it hard to get married, or the issues of marriage are very difficult. And people are, for all sorts of reasons, are staying single. And therefore, the church needs to understand what that's all about and how to address it, and not just go, that shouldn't be.
So can you give me some statistics, like what percentage of the population is single, of adults? Obviously children are not married, so let's leave sort of under 18s out of this. But, you know, what percentage are we looking at?
Yeah, so 40% of UK adults are single, which is a huge amount. I mean, that's almost half of the UK adult population. And as Jackie said, this is increasing every year, and it's increasing in every age group. It's interestingly growing fastest among those aged 50 to 65. So this is definitely across the ages. And I think sometimes there is a misconception in churches that single people are kind of aged 18 to 30, you know, they haven't got married yet. But actually, single can mean so many different things. It can be someone who's never married, but they could be in their 40s or 50s or 60s. It could be someone who has been married and is now divorced, or they've lost their partner and they're a widow or a widower. It could be a single parent and maybe they have children and they're navigating that. And then also in a church context, we also have people who are perhaps married, but they're coming to church alone, and perhaps because their partner doesn't attend church, they're not Christian, or their partner is away overseas a lot with work, or perhaps their partner's in a care home. And so they're experiencing a lot of life and church life and their faith often as a single person. So they actually resonate with quite a lot of the same issues that single people do in church.
Wow, I hadn't quite taken in the experience of people who are married but feel single. I think that you're right. That is going to be a larger proportion than I thought of. So do you think the church, we've talked about this sort of this 1950s idea, but do you think the church has a sort of theological perspective that, like, marriage, obviously Jesus holds marriage high in scripture. Paul talks about, you know, I'd rather you get married than burn with lust. And people have taken those sort of passages. Do we think we've created a theology or in our churches that pushes people or makes people who are single feel inferior or like they're not as biblical somehow?
I think it depends partly on which church tradition it is. I mean, obviously the Old Testament is much more about marriage. Protestant churches obviously are more about marriage. Catholic churches, obviously the leaders of the church and the Catholic Church are single. There's a much more developed sense of singleness. The New Testament talks a lot about people who are single. And so it really varies. You can find plenty in the Bible about marriage and how marvelous it is. And you can also, as you've just pointed out, there is so much in the New Testament that celebrates singleness. So, you know, obviously we should celebrate both marriage and singleness. And there is enough there for everybody.
Yeah. And Jesus was single. Let's not forget that. Hey.
Jesus, well, that we have a T-shirt saying Jesus was single, and lots of the disciples were single.
Yeah.
Some were married. You know, it's just, it shouldn't be when you meet somebody socially and you're single and they're married. It shouldn't be like, oh, you poor thing, you're single, which is so much of what happens in social interaction. And, you know, when the church has a new family joining, it's like this big celebration. Oh, a new family. It should be the same if it's a single person. And, you know, we also tend to see there are a lot of single women in the church, but where are all the men? And what's happened to the single men? And there are just as many single men as single women.
Yes, but not in church necessarily.
They're not in church. And maybe they haven't got there because they don't feel that, I mean, there are single men and they often don't feel welcome in church because people say to them, well, why aren't you married? Why haven't you married somebody?
Yeah. I read an article recently about a man who had written a play about some black women suing the church. And it's a play, it's not real. But the idea was they were saying that the church had told them that they should come to church and they should pray for a godly man and marry a Christian. But the ratio in their church was 7-1, 7 women to 1 man. And the men that were in church they felt were not suitable for marriage. And so they were very cross with the church and in the play taking him to court over this idea that you've led us to expect that we should be married, but this is not going to happen for us. And Ray is single in the charts at the moment. Where the hell is my husband? And it's a funny song, but there's a conversation with her grandmother in it, and her grandmother saying, your husband is coming. This sort of sense that the church and Christian parents are promising young single women in the church that they will get married and that they should be marrying a godly man. But if these men are not in church, what's going to happen. And so, do they marry outside of the church and all of this? So does the church create unhealthy narratives around this? Or are they overtly communicating it, or is it unconscious in the church? What do you think about this?
I mean, when we did that survey, it was about 2012 actually, and we are planning to do another one. That narrative came very strongly through, and you hear it a lot. And there are still a lot of churches, that story doesn't come from nowhere. That is a very strong narrative. Yes, the church will, basically, you must marry only a Christian. It's not all churches who say that, but it's certain churches that do. You must marry a Christian. Some of these churches say you shouldn't join a Christian dating site because God will find you somebody, so now. And if you don't get married, then the church will look after you. And that's often not the case, that you will get married. God will find you somebody. And you say, well, look at the statistics. If you are in a kind of church that has 7 to 1, then some people are not going to get married if they don't marry somebody through another the way.
I think that can be very hard to accept as well, particularly when you've been fed this narrative that, if you just pray hard enough, God will find you a spouse, they're coming. And, I actually think that if the church was just speaking about this more and actually had a more healthy narrative towards singleness and, how it's okay to be single and how do we deal with disappointment or our dreams and our desires not quite working out the way that we hoped in kind of any respect. That could be singleness, or it could be something completely different. If we talk about that more, if we talk about the positives of singleness, we talk about how we can use our gifts to glorify God, how we can all find purpose. It's not just getting married and having a family that brings you purpose and fulfillment, but actually there are so many other ways that we can do that. If that narrative was more spoken about in the church, I think people would be more prepared to walk that journey of potential disappointment, that they might find a spouse, but if they don't, it's not the end of the world. And actually, there are other options, and God still has a good plan for you.
And of course, some churches, like the Catholic Church, you may not like that approach, but they'll say, well, you can marry somebody who's not a Catholic. They just have to sign up and say the children will be brought up Catholic. Different churches have different approaches. And churches have to think quite carefully and reflectively about what it is they're asking of the members of their congregation. If they say, if you don't get married, we will fully support you and you will be just as loved and cherished and important, but they don't do that. That's the trouble.
And that support, we will support you. What does that mean? Because our society puts a lot of pressure on a nuclear family in terms of support. So whether it's pensions, like whether it's just the economics of sharing a house or a flat, even if you're sharing the rent, it's cheaper. Holidays, it costs a lot. If you're sharing, it's cheaper. What do you do on holidays and things that our culture tends to say these are nuclear family things? Do you go back and see your parents? Are they still alive? Are they close by enough? There's a lot of things where the church, when you say we will support you, I'm like, no, I don't think the church does do that. They expect a family to do that. And then, whoops, well, we didn't really think. So, yeah, I wonder what churches mean when they say we will support you. Does it mean just we won't judge you? It just gets enough. We're social creatures. I think we need more connection relationship than is necessarily on offer.
Well, that's where we come to, what Single Friendly Church talks about, which is the 5 steps, really, which is how we support and affirm single people in church.
One of the steps is about language and our messaging. And it's a big thing around this word family. And what do we mean by family? Are we talking about nuclear families, or are we talking about church family? And if we do believe that church should be the family of God, and, you go back to the book of Acts and Paul and his letters, and he talks about this, and, you see that in the early church, they were a big family, and, they all looked after one another, and they looked after the widows, and, they were so concerned about making sure that everyone was looked after and provided for, that they had, committees for these kinds of things. And so it was something they took really seriously. And then you look at our church today and you think, are we looking after single people? Are we looking after kind of everyone in that same way? And I think sometimes, we will come together perhaps for certain services or certain events, but what about outside of that time? What about the kind of single mother who's trying to raise her kids by herself, trying to go to church, trying to get involved, trying to make friends, but she can't attend Bible study because she's looking after her children?
Yeah.
What about the single person who is sick and doesn't have any family nearby to look after them? Is someone from the church going to come and bring them a meal? Often this happens when, people have a baby, there's a little meal train or something that's organized, but does this happen for single people when they're unwell or when they're going through a difficult time? So it's thinking about some of those things, and actually how can we look beyond, what has kind of become the culture, and how can we actually go back to what the family of God really should be?
Oh, it's really good. And I do think we have sort of, as a society, devolved a lot of that responsibility either to the government, we think they'll get some benefits or something, or we've devolved it to nuclear families, and the church has sort of stepped away because we think, well, the church doesn't have to step in because somebody else will. But it's the difference between having a service or having a benefit and having people who care, and that it feels totally different. It feels very different when somebody cooks you a meal to somebody giving you some money to buy food. It's just a totally different experience. And so how does the church step into that caring? Yeah, I think you're totally right. We care for those we think are poor or can't afford it, maybe, but the church will be like, oh, that's a mercy ministry. But the community care, I think singles can fall through the gap because they may have money, they may have a job, they may be able to care for themselves, so it doesn't quite qualify. So yeah, I think churches need to think broader and wider.
I mean, one of the classic things is, Sunday morning, people go to church, and then Sunday lunches. Now, it doesn't have to be the church has to provide Sunday lunch for everybody, but just, where are you going now? Do you want to meet? Do you want to go to the pub? Just acknowledging that some people are going to go back and spend Sunday with their family, and some people have maybe nowhere to go.
Mm.
And people are just nervous about taking on that responsibility. And some churches just do it very naturally. And it's just something to think about. And it's not that difficult. And then, of course, there are other times of year, which we'll talk about, with Christmas, which, where people are really needing, some single people do have family and some people maybe don't, or their family isn't anywhere near. So, as you say, it's not that they're, pity cases,
No.
or that they haven't got jobs, or they're struggling to eat, but they just don't have people around in the way that other people might.
Yeah, and I would say sometimes, it's not like we're thinking, as Jackie said, about, a pity case, or, we've got to look after these poor, lonely single people. But actually, community is so enriching for everyone. And actually, married people can be lonely too. Married people can be isolated, and actually having, just closer friendships in church where we can really just do life together is really beautiful. I'm thinking about the times when I was single and I had to move house by myself, and I did it, and, it was okay, but it would have been so much better if I'd had people to share that with. Or even, if a single person is trying to buy a house, or make another big decision kind of similar to that, it's hard not to have someone to bounce ideas off. And so I know people who, their married friends have come with them to look at houses. And actually that can be quite a fun thing that you can do together, and a way of supporting each other. And the single person can repay that as well, and, support them in the things that they're doing. So it's about sharing life together, and just enjoying that.
Adulting is hard for all of us. And I definitely agree. I had people who came with me to buy cars because I'm like, I'm not the expert. I need somebody to make sure I'm not making impulsive decisions. So I think you're right. Yeah. It's these other things of doing life with people, and it means inviting people into real community. So yeah, you're right. So you were going through different ways that churches can support singles. Keep going.
Yeah, so we have 5 steps. We tried to make it as simple as possible, because sometimes when you look at this, this issue of, how do single people feel fully welcome and valued in church, it can just feel like this big minefield. So we've kind of narrowed it down to 5 areas of church life, which we call the 5 steps. And so the first one is thinking about who is single. And it's about thinking about who is single in your congregation, who is single in your local area, and just expanding that view of singleness beyond young people in their 20s. and perhaps students, but also thinking about kind of older singles, people who've been divorced, widowed, single parents, as we talked about before, and just kind of expanding that mindset and thinking about it for your local context. And is your church currently catering to them, or are there some things that you need to rethink? And the second one, as we talked about, is language and our messaging. Is the language that we're using accessible for everyone, or are we sometimes focused on families? And then there's thinking about the welcome and the belonging aspect, and how do we make it easy for people to come to church by themselves? And that's one of the biggest barriers to coming to church for single people. It's just turning up by yourself and just knowing how to, who to talk to, where do I sit? Has anyone noticed that I'm here? And so how do we get single people from beyond the door to actually feeling like they're part of the heart of community? And then the fourth step is thinking about our teaching. So what messages are coming from the front? Are we speaking into single people's lives as much as we're speaking into married people? Do we have any teaching on singleness? When we've done webinars in the past, we found that actually a lot of churches have never had any teaching on singleness. And I think this is something that could be so positive and so valuable for lots of people. And then the final step is leadership. Do you have single people in leadership in your church? And that could be from the front of church, so that single people are visible. It's not just married couples, which kind of normalizes singleness. And it just shows, you don't have to be married. You don't have to graduate into it in order to use your gifts and in order to lead and in order to be mature in your faith. Actually, there are single people doing this too. So having single people at the front is really key, but also just encouraging single people to use their gifts, whatever that is. Often you don't see single people leading small groups because it just defaults to families and couples because, it's like there's two of you and perhaps you have a house, so we can just meet there. But why not have a single person leading with a couple, or have two or three single people leading together? So it's finding different ways to just empower people to use their gifts and feel like they can really contribute something to the life of the church. So that's a little brief overview of some of the things that we recommend.
Wow. Okay, so I want to come back to the wording one about family. So we've talked about this in another podcast where people, the stand if you're able sort of phrase that people say, trying to be inclusive to disabled people, but actually it draws more attention to it. So if we're doing something intergenerationally, we can say families are welcome. And that's a way of sort of saying we welcome children and adults and grandparents or whatever. It's kind of a shorthand people are saying. But as you explained really clearly at the beginning, Beth, it can make a single adult feel not welcome. So can you give us some helpful wording or alternative wording? Because we just get into a pattern when we're leading church and we say the same sort of things. It's almost like we need a new little script. What is helpful leadership language to welcome people? Is it calling out all the different age groups and different varieties? You're bound to miss one. Or is there just a different way of saying it?
I think there's nothing wrong with using the word family if you explain it. And I think sometimes, if you explain we are the family of God, if you always put church in front of it, so church family, that sometimes can be enough, because some people do like the word church family, that idea. And that's a very positive image for some single people. Although others say that they do feel that their family is quite a painful word for them. So sometimes we do need to find alternative expressions. So for example, if you're having a family service, one thing we say is you could change it to something else. Obviously, the most common one is all age. Some people don't like that either. You can use all together, worship for all, worship for everyone. There's lots of different things, and not everything's going to be right for your church context. But it's about being a bit creative.
Church fellowship, church community. I mean, there's all sorts.
Community is a big one.
The community is a big one. And I mean, I think it is just about being very explicit about family being, that means, whether you're old, young, single, whatever, but it can be almost too all-inclusive, embracing, I've seen some which are so it's almost patronizing. But if you just say family, it just means everybody. Yeah. It doesn't mean that you have to have a family as such. But then, you're almost, as you say, you're almost explaining it away. So, I personally like church fellowship, church community.
It's helpful.
Or you don't have to say anything. Just say church service.
Everybody's welcome. And do you have some top tips on that, making people feel welcome? If a single person is coming into church, a church service on their own, what are ways people can connect them? Is it somebody on the door saying, come and sit with me? Is it introductions? Is it having people round tables? I mean, I'm sure there are as many varieties of church and ways to do this, but what is helpful? What are ways that people can do that well?
I mean, there was something on one of our videos where a church found that getting people to sit around tables was better than just getting them to hang around. I mean, obviously, that means you might be at a table that you don't it was stuck with, but it just does mean that you are physically, I mean, that's after the service, of course, but you're physically sitting at a table. So you're literally with other people rather than just sort of hanging around, hopefully, and hoping that somebody will talk to you. And that means that people are more likely to stick around.
Yeah.
But yes, I think it's also down to the proactivity of the welcomers, and also having welcomers who belong to different, somebody of a certain age, or somebody who is single, or somebody who's married. So people feel that when they show up, there's somebody who looks sort of broadly like them.
That's really helpful.
Yeah. I think it really depends on the individual person as well. Some people, if they're first exploring church and faith, or perhaps they've had a bad experience of church, they do just want to come and sit at the back and then leave. But I think, yeah, as Jackie said, partly it's about the welcome when you come in, and, just having a really good welcome team, which we know that a lot of churches already do. But it's also, we had this conversation recently as a team about thinking about the goodbye. And so if someone is going to slip out of the church at the end, perhaps they see the coffee time and they're like, oh, it's too much. I've been in churches in the past where no one's spoken to me. I'm just going to leave. That as you leave, if someone sees you and says, oh, thank you so much for coming, it's going to make you feel more seen than if you just slipped out and no one had noticed. And so it's going to make you feel more likely to come back. And perhaps, after a few times of going to church, you might feel that, yes, maybe I can stay for coffee. Maybe I can give that a go. And I think also having a moment in church where people are encouraged to turn to someone they don't know, but it has to actually be someone you don't know. I mean, sometimes, we do the peace in church and everyone just turns to, their spouse or their family or their best friend and just says, oh, peace be with you. But actually encouraging from the front, find someone you've never met before, or find someone who, you haven't spoken to in a while, and greet them. Turn to someone you don't know first, and, turn to the person you came with last. I think if by when we're kind of getting this into the culture of that moment, I think it makes it a lot more powerful.
Yeah. And I do think we have, I don't know if it's British culture, but there is a sort of reserve. There is a like, oh, I'm not going to talk to strangers. I mean, I have a family of extroverts and they constantly talk to everybody else in the world. But I know that is very unusual, and they comment on it, how friendly they are. So I think there is something of like training our congregations to be courageous and talk to people and include people. And as you say, the church culture will shift as people start befriending, connecting, eating meals with each other, sitting down for coffee together. But I think it is that, how do we move from being a bit cliquey and a bit scared? And often it's insecurity and it's shyness, all of those kind of things in us. It's absolutely nothing about the new person who's come to church. It's our own congregation's fear that is stopping them being friendly. But yeah, I think there's some challenge there. In Roots Resources, we'll often do interactive things where it's like, talk to the people next to you, make this thing together, sit around a table, discuss this. As you move around in the worship space, you're not sitting next to who you were sat next to before, and you end up talking to somebody else, or you're making something. It's less awkward to have a conversation about something rather than just the small talk. So sometimes just making more interaction in our services allows for that relationship building, and it's less awkward. You mentioned it a little bit earlier, Jackie, that Christmas can be particularly hard for those who are single. Can you just unpack that a bit more? Why is Christmas so hard, and what as the church can we do about that?
So with Christmas, there is a fundamental assumption that people have somewhere to go at Christmas, and that is usually with their family. With churches become a rather different place during Christmas time. It becomes very oriented towards children, family. There are certain kinds of service that are very much about family. Obviously, it's centered around the Holy Family, and there's just a very sort of particular ritual around it. Also, when Christmas, Christmas happens, obviously Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. And after that, particularly in the Anglican tradition, although we were chatting to somebody from who's Catholic, it doesn't happen in the Catholic tradition. The vicar goes off. The vicar's told pretty well that you've had a very busy time. I mean, they've been running around doing school services that they've been absolutely rushed off their feet. And it's like, you need to take a week off now. So between Christmas and New Year, until January, the vicar goes off. And so there is this very empty time for people who aren't in their family unit, when nothing's going on. So it's quite painful because people are seeing people in their family units during Christmas. Often Christmas Day is a very different kind of service to your average service. And then there's a sort of blank where it's cold and damp and miserable and you haven't got anything to do. So it's a time where churches really need to reflect that the leaders don't have to do it themselves, but they need to think about how people who don't have anywhere to go on Christmas Day might be able to come to a meal actually in the church or, within the church family, and have activities between Christmas and New Year. But at the moment, there are many churches that effectively shut up shop.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be a church service. It could be a Boxing Day walk. It could be come and do puzzles, and we'll have a fire in the fireplace, and we'll just drink hot chocolate and watch rubbish television, which is what everybody else is doing around their houses with their families.
Exactly.
But it's inviting people in, isn't it? But I guess the question is, how does the church orchestrate that, or without that feeling cringy? I think there's a concern that it's like, again, not wanting people to feel like there's a pity ask or anything like that. The hope would be that we're aware of the single people in our church. We've pre-asked them, invited them for Christmas, and said, come hang out with us, come do this. That would be the dream, wouldn't it? That it's done well ahead of time. But probably more likely is that there's people who are slipping through the gap who aren't being asked. And then the church is like, well, do we put something on for them? So how do we do that it's not that kind of doing to them?
I think it's about planning and saying to people who wants to be part of the Christmas plan. And, I live in West London, and there are an awful lot of people living in London who, they're away from their families. It's very expensive to travel home for Christmas, or you might have to work over Christmas. So, we were once hearing from a vicar in a church in, an area of London which had a very large number of people in the church who came from overseas, and they just got them together and they took over Christmas. People just got together and did different things over Christmas, and actually the vicar and her husband didn't have to do that much. They just, it was just a takeover by different members of the congregation, which was very inspiring to hear. But it can happen if you allow the different members of the congregation to say, would you like to help plan this? It doesn't have to be the vicar doing it.
Yeah. Or even if the church has a kitchen, creating a space for people to host their own. Because I think sometimes that is also a thing, like, I'd like to host, but I don't feel like the big kitchen and I have lots of tables, I can invite 20 people, and rather than just who'll fit around my dining table. So yeah, I think you're right. It's permissioning, isn't it? And thinking outside the box.
Yeah. And it can be wonderful, and it can be a great Christmas for people.
What about those who find Christmas hard emotionally? I'm just thinking of people who maybe are widowed or divorced, or single parents who are, Christmas is all about the children, then the kids have gone to their partner for Christmas Day, and they're like, oh, what can we do specifically in those sort of instances?
Yeah, I think it's about listening to them and finding out what they need. And I think it's hard to know. It's about providing kind of space for those emotions in perhaps the Christmas service, but without kind of patronizing people, and kind of doing it in a kind of a natural and organic way. I mean, there are things that people do, people put on blue Christmas services, which actually I think are really beautiful. And it doesn't have to be, this big kind of intense thing. It can just be a a kind of space. It's an alternative service that can just be reflective, and people can come with whatever they are carrying, whether it is grief, whether it is pain, whether it's just, perhaps a bit of disappointment and struggling with Christmas. And they can have that space just to be. And it's kind of a gentle message of hope, but without diminishing kind of how other people are feeling in that moment. And there's lots of things you could do. I heard of one church that, everyone was invited to put a candle by the crib. And then towards the end of the service, they were invited to go up and light their candle to show kind of Jesus bringing hope to the place that they're in, but also acknowledging that before the candle was lit, that is how they're feeling, and that is completely a valid emotion for this time of year. So you can do things like that, or you can just have a normal service, but acknowledge that in the prayers, and just try not to make it that the narrative is Christmas is a wonderful, happy time for everyone. We all have somewhere to go. It's really fun and easy, and particularly at Christmas on a Christmas morning. Kids who perhaps they ask, oh, what did you get for Christmas? What did you get for Christmas? And actually, if you're a single parent and perhaps, you've been struggling to provide everything that your kids need that Christmas, or perhaps, as you said, your kids aren't there, or perhaps you are single and you wanted to have kids and it never happened for you, that can be extremely painful. So it's thinking about how some of those things are perceived and trying to kind of cater for everyone, but do it in a sensitive way. And yeah, as we said, kind of provide that space in the prayers and perhaps in a different service for people to really just feel seen in however they're feeling.
No, that is really helpful. If people are listening to this and mulling this over and thinking, oh gosh, there's actually quite a lot of thinking I need to do on this. Actually, we probably need to overhaul a lot of the way we do things. Does Single Friendly Church Network offer support, coaching, training for churches that people can connect in with and help review what they're doing?
Yes, we do. We've got lots of free resources on our website. Is free and freely available. And we also have an audit that churches can sign up for. And it basically guides them through the 5 steps that we mentioned about, that kind of talk about different areas of church life. And it helps churches to see what they're already doing really well. And you'll probably find that there is more than you think. And when you actually start to think about each of these kind of steps in more detail. And then it just gives really helpful practical tips of perhaps things that you might want to include for your church context in each of those areas. For example, with language or welcome or teaching. And it might be, not everything's going to be relevant for your church, but there might just be 1 or 2 things that you think, I'd never thought about doing that before. And actually that might be really helpful. And we also have lots of resources on Christmas as well. We have webinars kind of going on about 3 times a year that you could sign up for. And yeah, we're just here to help the church. We just want to kind of help and equip them to be places where single people can really thrive.
Well, I do really appreciate what you guys are doing and how you're supporting the church. I wonder if there's something that you could say, that one of the things was around teaching on singleness. And if church leaders are listening to this and thinking, I haven't ever done any teaching on singleness before, or is there books that you would recommend, or are there webinars or courses or stuff that church leaders could either send people on or go on themselves so that they could teach really well on those subjects?
So yeah, we have lots of books on our website. We've got a whole list, and one of them that's really helpful for church leaders thinking through these issues and for single people is called Single Minded, and it's by our trustee, Reverend Kate Wharton. And yeah, there's also the course on singleness, which can be done in any church, and that is done by Eleanor Jeans, who is single herself. And I think it's a 5-week course that churches can do. But we have lots of tips for teaching. If you wanted to do a sermon or a talk on kind of singleness and kind of the what does the Bible say about it, how can we kind of react and respond to that as a church, then we do have tips for preaching that on our website. And I think actually it is, if you can, to find someone who is single or who has previous lived experience of being single to deliver the talk. I think that's really important, or to be heavily involved in planning it. Because I think sometimes when something's delivered from someone who doesn't have experience of singleness, sometimes the nuances are just not quite there.
Yeah, no, I think that's really helpful. I think it's that feeling seen and heard and empathy. And I think this is part of this whole conversation, is is the empathy of recognizing how other people are living and the challenges, and how can we best stand alongside each other. And we will all, I heard somebody say, that might have been you, Jackie, that we will all experience singleness in our life. You know, if you're married now, you will have a season of singleness, or you have had a season of singleness.
I think the difficult bit is also that people have a different experience of singleness, just as they do with marriage.
Yeah.
Or parenting or whatever. So I think it's helpful if you are preparing a talk on singleness or getting somebody to do it, that you hear the different experiences, because you don't want somebody, the same person every year who has one story to tell.
It gets rolled out.
And it's not going to be the same. Beth and I, we will have had different experiences of being single, different perspectives. There is no one single person. And, a man's experience of singleness is going to be a bit different too. So it's good to get different stories there.
That's really helpful. Great. Well, I think we've given people plenty to chew on, and I'm hoping that people will get in touch, visit your website, download some resources, go on some courses, buy some books. Jackie's written an article in Roots magazine about supporting single people at Christmas, and I hope people will read that. But I just want to encourage us to reflect and allow God and the Holy Spirit to challenge our bias or any default setting, and to do better as a church, because we can do better. And I think, Jackie, you mentioned this before, it's not actually that hard. We don't need to change the architecture of the church. We don't have to have a big theological argument about it. We don't disagree on this. We can just lean in and do a bit better, can't we?
Yes. Unfortunately, which is great, but in a way that makes it it means it doesn't get debated as much.
Yeah, you're right.
Because some of the people have had to, on other issues, have had to really challenge themselves and debate it. Whereas with singleness, there hasn't been, I don't think there's been much of a debate, because everybody would in principle say, well, yes, of course, we probably need to think more about singleness. It just hasn't really happened. It is actually starting to happen. For instance, in the Methodist Church, that's been a big issue for them. They have picked this up, and it's being debated much more. So I'm hoping that for other churches, they will start to pick up on that once they've got over some of the other issues that they seem to be debating at the moment.
Yeah.
So hopefully it will become more of an issue.
Thank you. Well, thank you both for your time and for your expertise on this. I really appreciate you being on the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Jackie's written an article for Roots on how churches can welcome and support single people at Christmas time. Find it at rootsforchurches.com. Links to the article, the Single Friendly Church website, and resources we discussed are in the show notes. Roots exists to help you lead great church that's growing, relevant, engaging, authentic, and together. We've got Bible-based resources to help you welcome, worship, ask questions, convene conversations, host small groups, build authentic community, and create invitational missional events. Head to rootsforchurches.com to take a free trial and explore our wealth of resources, available for a very affordable annual subscription. You can explore a digital subscription or add on our stunning full-colour magazines that help you to prepare and share offline. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe and share it with leaders in your church and network. And leave us a review, as that helps others find it. Together, we can grow.